Welcome back to Goosebump on the Midnight series, where the most terrifying haunted stories are told. Arthur clutched his stinging cheek, looking at his father with a mixture of fury and despair. His father, a man of the 21st century, a successful entrepreneur, was so blind he refused to acknowledge the truth right in front of him. Or perhaps he knew, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. The argument ended in a stalemate. Arthur knew he couldn't convince his father. He was alone in this fight. Meanwhile, the curse continued its work, silent and relentless. It was no longer just sounds or accidents. It began to attack the core members of the family. Mr. Vance started showing strange symptoms. He suffered from severe abdominal pain, cramping so intense it felt like someone was twisting his insides. But when he went to the best hospital for examinations and endoscopies, the doctors concluded his organs were perfectly normal. Yet the pain tormented him every night. Worse, patches of gray-brown, scaly skin, rough and dry like tree bark, began to appear on his body. They started on his back, where he couldn't see them, then gradually spread to his chest, arms, and legs. He scratched until he bled, but the itching never stopped. The most expensive ointments were useless. His skin grew drier and more cracked by the day, looking like a parched landscape after a long drought. Richard Vance, who had always taken pride in his dignified appearance, now had to wear long-sleeved shirts all day, even indoors, to hide the disgusting marks. Eleanor sank deeper into madness. She no longer wept, but began to laugh. She wandered the house, laughing to herself. She talked to the shadows on the walls, saying Julian had come back to play with her. One night, Arthur found her in the dying garden, scooping up handfuls of dry, barren earth and eating it with relish, giggling as she said, "My son's earth tastes so sweet." Arthur felt like he was living in hell. He had to care for his parents while trying to find a way to break the curse. He knew science was helpless. He had to turn to spiritual methods, the very things he once considered mere subjects of research. He went back to old man Silas, begging him for a way out. This time, he was not a researcher, but a desperate man crying for help. Silas looked at him and shook his head. Mother Pow's curse is not an ordinary spell that can be broken by another. It was a plea of resentment sent to the Forest Mother. When the Forest Mother is angry, no shaman would dare intervene, my boy. So there's no other way? Arthur asked in despair. Silas was silent for a long time, gazing at the distant mountains. Then he said, "There is only one way. Penance. True, heartfelt penance. You must return what was taken. You must soothe the anger of the land. But will your father agree to do it?" Arthur bowed his head. He knew the answer was no. That night, as Arthur was researching old texts about the atonement rituals of the native people, he received a call from the lab in the capital. His researcher friend's voice was filled with a mixture of excitement and confusion. "Arthur, that plant sample you sent is bizarre. We've analyzed the DNA. It doesn't match any known plant species in our database. Its cellular structure. It's very strange. It has protein components, amino acid chains, that resemble human tissue." Arthur dropped the phone. The sound of the screen shattering echoed in the silent room. A sprout of vengeance rises. To be claimed by human hand. The sprout of vengeance had truly grown from flesh and blood. The curse wasn't an invisible force. It was a living entity, a hideous hybrid of plant and human, growing and thriving within his family. And its roots had sunk deep into this land of sorrow. The Vance family villa was now nothing more than a living tomb. The former elegance and splendor had been replaced by an atmosphere of decay and ruin. The bitter scent of herbal medicine from Mr. Vance's room mingled with the musty smell from the withered garden, creating a distinctive odor of approaching death. The last of the servants had left, leaving the family of 3 to struggle alone in their self-made nightmare. Arthur became everything: a son, a nurse, a janitor, and the only sane person left to witness the collapse of his family. Each day was an ordeal. He had to feed his mother spoonfuls of porridge while she giggled and talked to her invisible friends. He had to change his father's dressings, listening to his groans and curses during his fits of pain. Mr. Vance's condition worsened daily. The bark-like scales had spread over nearly his entire body, hardening and cracking, oozing a foul yellow fluid. But what was happening inside him was even more terrifying. He began to cough up not blood, but a dark brown liquid, thick with tiny fibers that looked like young roots. Richard Vance, once a man of immense power, was now a helpless invalid, confined to his bed. His fury and arrogance were slowly being replaced by a primal fear. He was starting to believe. He no longer accused Arthur of being superstitious. In his delirious fits of pain, he would call out Mother Pow's name, begging, cursing, then weeping like a child. "Let me go. I'll give it all back. I'll give you back the forest. Please, just let me go." But his belated repentance echoed only against the silent walls. The curse did not hear, or it did not want to. Eleanor's horror took a different, even more frightening path than physical agony. She no longer ate dirt. She began to converse with a new invisible friend. This friend, as she described to Arthur during rare moments of lucidity, was a young native girl in a traditional indigo dress with her hair in 2 braids. The girl would appear at dusk, sitting on the windowsill of her room, singing her lullabies. "She sings so beautifully, Arthur," Eleanor would say, her eyes clear with a chilling madness. "Her voice is like a mountain stream. She says she's the daughter of the Forest Mother. She's come to take us home." Arthur tried setting up a camera in his mother's room. When he reviewed the footage, he only saw Eleanor talking to an empty space. He rewound and replayed the tape, his eyes glued to the screen. And then, his blood ran cold. For a split second, just a few frames, a shadow flickered across the lens. A small shadow, shaped like a child, blurry and indistinct, but it was undeniably there. The curse wasn't just punishment. It was a game. It was gnawing away at its victim's sanity before delivering the final blow. It had turned their home into a stage where each member of the Vance family was forced to act out their own tragedy. Clara, Julian's widow, had moved back to her mother's house after the funeral. She was too terrified to stay. But the curse, it seemed, spared no one connected to the family. It was like a disease, spreading through the bonds of kinship. One afternoon, Clara called Arthur, her voice frantic. "Help me, Arthur. It's come for me. I couldn't sleep all night. That lullaby. It's inside my head. And in the mirror, I saw my face. It's turning into her face." Arthur rushed to Clara's house. He found her cowering in a corner, clutching a piece of a broken mirror. On her cheeks, a few wrinkles had appeared, and her fair skin was beginning to show brown age spots, identical to those in the old photographs of Mother Pow that Arthur had found in his research materials. In a desperate attempt to erase the image she saw, Clara had used the shard of glass to slash at her own face, which was now covered in blood. Arthur tried to comfort her, to take her to the hospital. But it was too late. A few days later, Clara was found hanging in her bathroom. She had left a short suicide note, scrawled in lipstick on the mirror, "I don't want to become a monster." The second death dealt a fatal blow to Arthur's remaining hope. He realized the curse had its own cruel logic. It didn't kill quickly. It slowly transformed its victims into living embodiments of their own sins. Julian, who had directly exploited the forest, was consumed by it. Clara, who had enjoyed the wealth born from that crime, was haunted by the victim's image until she took her own life. His father, the mastermind, was slowly turning into a decaying tree. His mother, the silent accomplice, was being led into madness by a child's spirit. And what about him? He was a beneficiary, someone who had used the money from that sin to get an education, to live a life of luxury. What fate awaited him? Arthur knew time was running out. He had to act before the curse came for him, or before his parents were completely consumed by it. He had no choice but to perform the ritual of penance old man Silas had spoken of, even without his father's consent. He had to do it himself. He returned to Silas, telling him about his family's desperate situation, about Clara's death. This time, the old man's eyes held not just pity, but a glimmer of empathy. He saw the determination and true pain in Arthur's eyes. He knew Arthur was different from his father and brother. "All right," Silas said after a long silence. "I will guide you. But you must remember, this is a dangerous path. You are attempting to speak with a spirit that is filled with rage. Any mistake could cost you your life." Following the old man's instructions, Arthur prepared for a complex ritual. He had to prepare the offerings himself, without any help. The offerings were not paper money or livestock. The main offering was penance made tangible. He had to go into the springwood itself, where his father's company was still operating, find the young saplings struggling to grow amidst the devastation, and carefully dig them up, roots and all. He had to gather 77 saplings, symbolizing the 77 spirits of the trees that had been wrongfully killed. Then, he had to take them to the exact spot where Mother Pao had died, replant them, and perform a ritual of atonement for an entire night, under the light of the full moon. "The best time is the upcoming full moon," Silas advised. "That's in 3 days. It's when the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead is at its thinnest. And you must go alone." Arthur began his task. He told his father he was going on a business trip for a few days to handle some of Julian's unresolved matters. He drove alone to the Springwood. The place no longer held the primordial beauty Silas had described. It had become a massive logging site. Red dirt roads crisscrossed the land like a spider's web. The hills were bare, scarred, with only stumps and rocks remaining. The sound of chainsaws and excavators still echoed in the distance, like the agonizing groans of the forest. Arthur felt a sharp pain in his chest as he witnessed the devastation. He understood Mother Pao's pain. He ventured deeper, avoiding the areas where workers were present. He searched for the young saplings, tiny lives clinging to existence amidst the destruction. Each time he used his spade to dig one up, he whispered an apology. He felt as if he were hurting himself. He worked relentlessly from dawn till dusk, his clothes soaked with sweat. At night, he slept in his car, unable to rest deeply because of the strange sounds of the wounded forest. He heard the moaning of the trees, the wind howling over the barren hills, and the familiar, mournful lullaby, now clearer and closer than ever before. After 3 days, Arthur had gathered 77 saplings. He loaded them into his car, exhausted but with a strange sense of peace in his heart. He felt he was doing something right, something that had to be done. He found the place where Mother Pao had passed away. It was a small patch of land just outside the forest fence, with a large, flat rock where her body had been found. The area was desolate, overgrown with weeds. Arthur began his work. He cleared the land and, using his remaining strength, dug 77 small holes. As night fell and the full, perfect moon began to rise over the mountain peaks, he placed each sapling in its hole, carefully packing the earth around it. He finished his work as the moon reached its zenith. The moonlight was brilliant, illuminating the space and making everything seem ethereal. Arthur knelt amidst the newly planted trees, lit 3 incense sticks and a single white candle. He didn't chant or pray. He simply knelt in silence, letting his sincere remorse radiate into the space. He told the story of his family, not with words, but with his thoughts. He apologized to Mother Pow, to the Forest Mother, not to beg for forgiveness, but simply to acknowledge the sin his family had committed. The silence was terrifying. There was only the chirping of insects and the sigh of the wind. Arthur closed his eyes, focusing his entire being. And then, he felt a change. The wind began to blow harder, carrying a bone-chilling cold. The candle on the ground flickered and died. The insects fell silent. An absolute, heavy silence descended. Arthur opened his eyes. He saw the shadows of the surrounding trees begin to writhe and twist under the moonlight, though there was no wind. And the lullaby began again. This time, it wasn't a distant echo, but right behind him, cold and clear.
Hush, now. The full moon shines on the deep night. The vengeful soul returns. To build a bridge of light.
Arthur felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He didn't dare turn around. He knew she had arrived. No, it wasn't just one. He could feel the presence of many other spirits, the spirits of the trees, of the earth, gathering around him. He could hear their whispers, their reproaches, their cries. The moon above was suddenly obscured. Arthur looked up. A dark cloud had appeared from nowhere, covering the moon and plunging the world into pitch-black darkness. And in that darkness, an image began to form before him. It was not Mother Pow. It was an amorphous creature. It was as tall as an ancient tree, woven from countless branches, roots, dirt, and gleaming white human skeletons. It had many gnarled arms, reaching out like dry branches. In the center of this chaotic mass, countless eyes were wide open, red as blood, all fixed on Arthur, burning with celestial hatred. It was the embodiment of the Forest Mother, a Forest Mother who had been desecrated, deformed by human greed. It was the wrath of the land itself. And from the creature's chest, where its heart should have been, Arthur saw a familiar face. The face of his mother, Eleanor. She was smiling at him, a vacant, soulless smile, and singing that ghostly lullaby. But the voice was not hers. The voice belonged to Mother Pow. The creature roared, a sound that shook the very mountains, a roar of pain and fury pent up for 15 years. One of its arms, as thick as a tree trunk, swung up and slammed down toward where Arthur knelt. The moon was shattered. His penance was not enough. Or perhaps it was simply too late. Once unleashed, such wrath could never be soothed. The colossal arm of the Forest Mother entity descended, carrying the might of 1,000 trees and stones. The air tore with a horrifying shriek. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, accepting his fate. He had done all he could. If his death could end it all, could repay the debt his family owed, he was willing. But the devastating blow never landed. A warm, golden light suddenly flared up from the ground. The 77 saplings Arthur had just planted simultaneously emitted a soft, gentle glow. The light formed a thin but resilient dome, stopping the monster's arm just inches from Arthur's head. A deep, dull thud echoed, as if wood and stone had struck an invisible wall. The forest mother entity roared in anger at being thwarted, but it also seemed surprised. Its arm trembled, trying to break through the dome of light, but it could not. Arthur opened his eyes, staring in amazement. He understood. His penance, though late, had not been entirely in vain. It hadn't been enough to soothe the forest mother's rage, but it had awakened the lingering goodness of the land, the spirits of the small lives he had saved. They, the weak saplings, were trying to protect him. But the dome of light was weakening against the entity's furious power. Cracks like a spider's web began to appear across its surface. Arthur knew this was only a temporary reprieve. He had to do something. He couldn't fight it with strength. He had to use understanding, to use his very soul. Mother Pow. Arthur stood up and bravely walked toward the monster, stepping out from the fading protective dome. He faced the wrath of heaven and earth head-on. If a sacrifice is needed to appease all this, then take my life. I am the son of Richard Vance. I am the one who benefited from the wealth of this sin. I will bear the guilt for my entire family. He stood before the monster, head held high, ready to accept death. There was no more fear. Only acceptance. The forest mother entity stopped its assault. Its countless blood-red eyes bored into Arthur, as if seeing into his very soul. They no longer held only hatred, but also curiosity, and judgment. The face of his mother on its chest was also looking at him, and this time, Arthur saw a single, black tear fall from its empty eye socket. The lullaby began again, but this time, it was no longer resentful. The melody was still tragic, but it was now tinged with forgiveness and sorrow. The words were like a prophecy, a final judgment.
Hush, now. A seed of life sown in the ash. A worldly debt is paid. To let the hatred pass.
The entity slowly retreated. The branches, roots, stones, and bones of its body began to disintegrate, falling to the ground like dust. It didn't disappear, but seemed to merge back into the earth, returning what did not belong to it. Eleanor's face also faded, leaving behind one last, sad smile, a smile of both release and farewell. The dark cloud dissipated. The full moon shone again, pure and peaceful. Before Arthur, there was only the flat rock and 77 young saplings, trembling gently in the wind, glistening under the moon as if coated in silver. Everything was quiet again. Arthur collapsed, his body exhausted, but his spirit felt light. He had survived. The curse, it seemed, had been lifted. Or rather, it had been transformed. Arthur returned to the villa as dawn was breaking. The house was still silent, but he no longer felt the cold, ghostly presence. He entered his father's room. Mr. Vance was still in bed. But the scales on his body had stopped spreading. They didn't vanish, but they had dried up and no longer oozed. His coughing had stopped. He was sleeping, a peaceful sleep for the first time in months. Beside the bed, Eleanor was also asleep in a chair, her face no longer twisted in madness, but etched with infinite exhaustion. The curse had not taken their lives. But it had taken everything they once had, their health, their pride, and their peace of mind. It had left them with a life sentence. That, too, was a punishment, one that would last the rest of their days. In the days that followed, Arthur began his work of repayment. Using the authority his father had given him, and with his father's silent consent, he ceased all harvesting operations in the Springwood. He convinced the board of directors to use the profits from Serenity King to establish a conservation fund to restore the forest. He invited foresters, botanists, and the native elders of the region, including Old Man Silas, to serve as advisors. The work was incredibly difficult. He faced opposition from those who had profited from the exploitation and skepticism from the villagers who had lost their trust. But Arthur persisted. He used not just money, but also his heart and his understanding. He lived in a stilt house with the villagers, went with them into the forest to plant trees, and joined them in ancient rituals to ask for the land's forgiveness. Slowly, the springwood began to revive. New green shoots emerged from the barren soil. The underground spring began to flow again, clearer and cooler than before. The sound of birdsong replaced the sound of chainsaws. Arthur's family also changed. Mr. Vance would never walk again. The bark-like skin would never heal. He spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, silently watching the garden in front of the house slowly turn green again under Arthur's care. He never uttered a word of apology, but in his eyes when he looked at Arthur, there was acknowledgement and gratitude. Eleanor never fully regained her sanity. Her memory was frozen somewhere in a distant past, before the tragedy began. She would sit for hours by the window, singing lullabies she made up herself, happy, childlike songs. Perhaps it was her soul's way of healing itself. Several years later, Arthur decided not to return to Europe. He stayed in Blackwood County, continuing his work. He was no longer a folklorist observing from the outside, he had become a part of that culture. He became the guardian of the springwood, just as Mother Pow had been. One afternoon, while walking through the now lush forest, Arthur stopped by the rock where Mother Pow had died. The 77 trees he had planted years ago were now tall, forming a cool, green circle. He sat on the rock, feeling the peace of the land. He no longer heard the resentful lullaby. Instead, he heard the whisper of the leaves, the murmur of the stream, the songs of the forest birds. It was a symphony of life. But sometimes, on nights with a full moon, when he stood on the highest point looking down at the valley, Arthur felt he could still hear a faint lullaby carried on the wind. A distant, soft lullaby, no longer filled with resentment, but serving as a reminder. A reminder of the debt between humanity and nature. A debt that sometimes takes a lifetime, or even generations, to repay. The debt owed to the land itself. The story of the Vance family's curse gradually became a new legend in Blackwood County. People told it to their children not to spread fear, but to teach them about respect. Respect for nature, respect for one's roots, and respect for the spirit sleeping peacefully in the heart of the earth. The story ends here. Thank you for your interest and for listening to our channel's stories. Please support the channel by like the video if you enjoyed it. Comment with your thoughts on the story and its ending. Share this video with your friends and family. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next thrilling horror story. Thank you all for your support.